Oscar Wilde did some time too, right?
I can imagine that
And
dude. I mean, writing the picture of Dorian Gray, you have to be mentally insane to think of that.
yeah, and like Jean-Paul Sartre also spent time in prison. I mean, Dostoevsky, he produced memoirs from House of the Dead based on time that he spent in prison, which was a result of a sentencing because he had read like an essay or something that he wasn't allowed to read because the emperor of Russia would get pissed. These are legends right here. Like
Yes.
these are guys that anyway, sorry to interrupt, go ahead.
No, no. Well, that segues perfectly into what I was going to say, which is that when you have some time alone and a break from your daily routine, which that's happened to me in my life a few times, where something will like drastic will change, and I have a total shift in the way that I'm living, and it causes me like a little bit of social isolation in some sort of way. And you start changing your habits, and you do things like read, and you do things like work out. That it changes your mindset completely, especially like I said, if you're reading, because you're intaking mind food. The problem with the reason that people don't read in today's society as much as I think that they should, I don't think it's just because of that everyone's in a rat race. I definitely think that's part of it, but people have time to, how much money does Netflix make with their subscriptions? They have time. It's not that they don't necessarily have time. You make time for what you want, but we live in a microwave society. People want things quick, and to stay, people can't even finish a single book, even if it's mad interesting, because their attention span it's not there. It's not their fault. It's just that with TV and YouTube and all these things, it's so easily digestible. Why use your eyes and your brain to process words when you can just sit there and like lurking Instagram while an audiobook plays in the background, or like a YouTube video or a
Yeah,
movie? So
yeah,
there's
yeah.
that. And then
There is that. Go ahead. It's a good conversation, man. Keep going.
all good, bro. I'm just wondering, you know, you you say that you weren't the strongest or the toughest, the hardest, whatever, in the prison system, and like you said, you don't have to be. I was just recently reading *Sapiens* by I don't know how to pronounce his name, so I'm not going to say it, but he just talks about how it's not like, just in history in general, the strongest people are not the ones that run the thing. Most of us are run by people far weaker than us that we could physically overpower.
Sure.
Lawyers, politicians,
Just
people who
women in
like.
general, man. Like women in general. The WNBA is not. Man, I'm gonna get canceled for saying this, but the WNBA is not as fun to watch as the NBA. That doesn't
Mhm.
mean that they're not proficient athletes. That doesn't
Yeah,
mean that their contributions throughout history shouldn't be paid attention to. Like So sorry. Go ahead.
it's all good. And in history, it's not the physical specimens that prevail. The biggest land mammals on Earth all went extinct very rapidly a long time ago. So it segues into, how did your life change and how did your mentality change? Not only being in prison and having a change of lifestyle, obviously, but when you got out of prison and you're like you can't own a marker, bro. You can't go to the supermarket without
Well,
asking them.
I can now. So actually, I should
Oh yeah,
clarify that from like 2011 to 2013, when I was violated for making a painting, I wasn't legally allowed to own or possess art making materials. That was a special condition of my parole. But when I moved to New York City in 2015 for the second time, when I moved to New York, their parole officers, they're busy, so they weren't like, oh, this graffiti guy's coming in, we got to make a special condition for him. They were just like, whatever. So that condition went away. So like,
mhm.
currently I am allowed to make art if I want, which is great.
Yeah,
But sorry, I forgot what else you were
yeah.
talking
Well,
about there.
basically, my question was, there was a time period where you couldn't own markers, you couldn't own chalk, bro.
Yeah.
You couldn't
Yeah.
go to the supermarket without asking them. You couldn't drive a vehicle. You couldn't own a cell phone. You couldn't be anywhere that you weren't contactable by landline phone. Ridiculous,
You
bro.
got it.
So
Yeah, you got it.
how
I mean,
did that?
I still have the 9 p.m. till 8 a.m. curfew. I still can't leave the county. That's why we're doing this over Zoom. Like my life is still impacted. And I think I know what you're getting at is basically like, you're asking how has this changed my life? Right. Like
Your mindset and your life, yeah.
yeah. So it greatly impacts, like being on parole impacts every decision I make. It impacts my day-to-day life, heavily. And I try to be mindful of how it could negatively impact me, like how it could make me angry or sad. And I try and mitigate that, so like, It's made me more conscious, more aware. You know, a lot of people deal with FOMO, the fear of missing out, when they look at Instagram and they compare their lives to others. I've had to learn how to manage that, because I'll be honest with you, man, I don't really have any friends that are on parole. You know, Daniel Montano, MF1, you guys might know who he is. He was the only person who I could talk to who truly understood what I was going through on a day to day. But you know what it has done overall, like, it's opened my eyes to being able to live life outside of being a graffiti writer. You know, it was being a graffiti writer was my everything from age 14 to, you know, when I was 21, when I got locked up. And it's still a big part of my life to some extent, but I've now learned to kind of appreciate other things. So, like, for example, you know, what one of the first people that actually, and it was just like by you know, random chance, one of the first people who was on my phone list was this guy Ned Vena, who is a successful artist. And like, I got him on the phone and he was like, hey, I just want you to know that, you know, you, just because you're locked up doesn't mean that you don't have a voice, doesn't mean that you can't still create. You know, you could make conceptual art from prison if you wanted to. And before that, I didn't even know what conceptual art was. I didn't know that, you know, there was a whole field of art that was based on ideas and not so much the artist's hand being involved in the work. So I started reading about it. And before I went to prison, I wasn't into fine art or any other types of expression, really. I listened to music always, but I wasn't aware of it to an extent. And I wasn't disciplined enough to sit down and read that much. I had read in high school. I was fortunate enough to go to, like, you know, a school that was a magnet school, which gave me a solid foundation to build on. And that is a huge advantage and a privilege that a lot of other guys in prison do not have. We're talking the average education level of a prison inmate is like 6th grade. And you got to keep that in mind when you're dealing with people in there too, because they'll flip out over a cookie. You know what I'm saying? So like you got to understand, you're dealing with 6th graders who are in the body of, you know, a 30-year-old man, fully well built. You know what I mean? So like, I think, but the main thing that it's done for me is it's just humbled me a lot. It's made me disciplined, and it's made me heavily consider the potential consequences of my actions. So I've never had a problem with alcohol. I've never had a problem with drugs. You know, I try to eat healthy, you know, and these are all things that a lot of people struggle with. And I think that, you know, it's, in a way, it's been an advantage, you know, but I say that with some hesitation, because I don't think that prison is the answer for anybody. And I don't think it's rehabilitative. I think the decisions that I made on my own as a result of, like, incurring these challenges are what kind of led to it. But I could have gone to prison and it could have done terrible things for me. Honestly, it could have made me a worse criminal. You know, that officer that you mentioned, his name's Donald Breeden. And I only say that because I want people to look it up. They could Google it and, like, verify my whole, like, you know, story that I've talked about him. That dude, when we were in the cell together, you know, late at night, you talk to your cellie. That dude was trying to get me to, like, do cocaine runs for him and shit when I got out. You know, so like, I could have, if I didn't have other opportunities to make money when I got out, maybe I would have considered that. Maybe I would have been like, damn, I could make $5,000 by just picking up a car and dropping it off and not asking any questions. Maybe I should do that. You know, so like, prison is not an optimal choice to rehabilitate an individual. In fact, the chances of it harming that person are way greater. But for me personally, I've just been very, very considerate of things ever since. And, you know, I'm not going to say that I haven't had hiccups along the way. I've had violations cases. I've been, you know, I went back to jail again. And like, I though it was for doing a painting, it's still, at the end of the day, like, I knew that the condition of my parole was that, you know, you can't own or possess art making materials. And I went ahead and I did it anyway, you know? So like, I look at things now where I'm like, okay, I heavily consider things, you know. If I'm driving in a vehicle and somebody gets in, they're like, yo, you care if I have this beer? I'm the type of guy now where I'm like, actually, why don't we just chill for a little while? How about you finish that? before I start driving. You know what I mean? Because, and not because I think that them having a beer is wrong. Like, it's just because what could potentially happen. And I always struggle with that growing up. I always felt like, I wanted to resist authority. So I always wanted to kind of do things against the grain. But you can do those things for sure. And maybe if you just abide by certain rules and regulations for a time, then when the time comes and you could strike, you could make it so much more meaningful. Like, I've been going to these protests and everything, and I wanted to participate. You know what I mean? And personally, like, I wanted to take things to a higher level, but I had to sit back and really think to myself, like, I'm not even supposed to be here. Like, I'm on parole. Like, I don't know. I've had my officer, like, it's a small town. I've seen my officer just on the streets before. You know what I mean? So, like, I'm like, I really got to watch what I do, and I think about it a lot more. And I think about the people that are close to me, how my decisions impact them. My mom, my girlfriend, like those, my friends, like those people. Like, I think about them when I'm doing things now. And that's something that, I didn't do as a young man. As a young man, it's just, you're just focused on yourself, like, pretty much alone. And so that's how it's impacted me.